She said 4 words in a hallway that nobody was supposed to hear, and by morning, 3 continents were arguing about what they meant. Was it a threat? Was it a joke? Was it the truth finally slipping out from behind a smile that had fooled everyone for 2 years? And why, out of every player on the tour, did the reigning world #1 go completely silent the moment she heard them? Because silence from a woman who never stops talking is the loudest sound in tennis. And somewhere in that silence, a door was closing on the old order of the sport while nobody was watching it happen. Alex Serrano was 19 years old and supposed to be invisible that week. A qualifier, a name nobody bothered to learn how to pronounce, until a courtside microphone caught her muttering something to her coach after a practice set against a player nobody remembers now. The words that slipped out weren't arrogance, they were worse than arrogance. They were certainty, quiet, flat, unshakable certainty that she belonged at the very top. Not eventually, not someday, now. Certainty like that in a teenager makes veterans nervous in a way that loud confidence never could, because you can laugh off noise. You cannot laugh off calm. The clip traveled before anyone could stop it, clipped, captioned, stripped of context, dropped into a locker room in another country entirely, where Nadia Kovalenko, 3-time Grand Slam champion, and the woman every rising star measured herself against whether she admitted it or not, watched it twice, said nothing to the cameras waiting outside, and walked past 3 reporters without the practiced smile she'd worn for a decade. That was the moment, right there, 30 seconds of dead air in a hallway, when this stopped being a story about a promising rookie and became something else entirely. Something that made grown analysts lean forward in their studio chairs and say, quietly, off script, this feels different. Nobody could explain why a few whispered words carried that much weight until someone dug up practice footage from 8 months earlier. A tournament in Asia, a doubles session nobody had bothered filming properly, where Alex and Nadia had shared a court for 11 minutes before an official pulled them apart. In that footage, barely audible under wind and crowd noise, there was an exchange. Brief, sharp, the kind that ends with one player's jaw tightening and doesn't get resolved so much as buried. For 8 months it stayed buried, filed away as nothing, until 4 whispered words in a hallway dug it back up, and suddenly nothing about this felt like nothing anymore. The tennis world pretends every rivalry is organic, but the truth underneath the truth is messier. People close to both camps started talking anonymously. One saying Nadia had been unsettled by Alex since that doubles session and never told anyone why. Another saying Alex's team had been quietly building a narrative around her for months, because attention is oxygen for a young athlete and there is no faster way to get it than aiming yourself directly at the throne. If any of that is true, the slip of the tongue in a hallway might have been the least accidental thing that happened all year. 3 days later, Nadia gave her first real answer, not to the 4 words directly, she never named them, but she said something in a press conference about respect being earned rather than declared. Said it evenly, almost gently, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted it, because gentle and cutting at the same time is a combination only true champions have mastered. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone realizes they just watched something happen that they won't fully understand until they replay it later, and replay it they did. Tennis forums dissecting 17 seconds of a press conference like it was a crime scene, because by then the story had stopped being about 2 athletes and had become about everyone else too. The fans who needed someone to be right and someone to be wrong, the ones who saw a fearless newcomer refusing to shrink herself, and the ones who saw a disrespectful child who hadn't earned the right to speak that way about a legend still very much in her prime. Both sides had a point, and that's exactly what made it unbearable and irresistible in the same breath, because there was no clean villain here, only 2 women standing on opposite sides of a line neither of them had drawn on purpose. Then came the part nobody saw coming, a leaked message, never confirmed, never denied, supposedly from inside Alex's team, describing her saying she didn't just want to beat Nadia, she wanted to be the reason people stopped saying Nadia's name first. Even the possibility it was real was enough to set the internet on fire. This wasn't ambition anymore, it was something closer to obsession. Every gesture between them got reread through that lens. None of it proved anything, and all of it proved everything, depending on which version you'd already decided to believe. What almost nobody talked about, because it didn't fit the narrative, was how young Alex actually was underneath all of this. 19, away from home for the 10th month in a row, giving interviews in a language that wasn't her first, while people 3 times her age dissected her tone like she was already supposed to have the composure of someone who'd survived a decade of scrutiny. There's a video barely watched compared to the viral clips of her sitting alone in a hallway after a loss 2 weeks before any of this started. Headphones in, not crying exactly, just still, in the specific way a person goes still when the weight of something hasn't fully landed yet. Maybe that stillness was where the certainty came from, not arrogance at all, but something closer to desperation dressed up as confidence. Because sometimes the only way to survive being 19 and terrified is to sound like you're not. If that's what those 4 words in the hallway actually were, a scared kid convincing herself out loud, then everyone who built a villain out of her had built it out of nothing but their own need for a story to be simple. There is a version of this story where it ends right there, quietly, 2 women choosing peace over spectacle, and for exactly 4 days, that's the version everyone believed, until a second clip surfaced, this one from a completely different angle, a fan's phone propped against a fence at that same practice session. In this version of the footage, the 10 minutes everyone had romanticized into a moment of understanding looked at certain seconds like something closer to an argument. Alex's hands moving sharply, Nadia stepping half a pace back, the way people step back from something they don't want to be standing too close to. The internet, which had just spent 4 days congratulating itself on a happy ending, tore that ending apart overnight because now nobody knew which version was real, the tender one or the tense one, and the 2 clips together did something worse than either alone could have done. They made the whole rivalry feel unknowable, which is somehow more addictive than any confirmed feud could ever be, because a mystery you can't solve doesn't fade. It festers. It gets refreshed every morning by someone new discovering it for the first time. Into that vacuum stepped a name nobody had been paying attention to at all, Alex's former junior coach, a woman who'd trained her from age 11 until she turned pro and then vanished from her team entirely without public explanation. She gave one interview, a small regional outlet barely noticed until someone translated it, and it spread like fire through dry grass. In it, she said something that reframed everything. Alex had been chasing Nadia specifically, not tennis in general, not greatness in the abstract, Nadia by name since she was 13 years old, that there was a poster, that there were years of matches studied frame by frame in a bedroom on the other side of the world. This wasn't a rivalry born in a hallway at all. It was a rivalry that existed in one direction for 6 years before the other woman ever knew it existed. And if that's true, then every interaction between them since wasn't 2 equals circling each other. It was a collision between someone who had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment and someone who had no idea she'd been cast in somebody else's story until it was already being written around her. That asymmetry changed the entire emotional shape of what people thought they were watching, because now the question wasn't who would win. The question was, what happens to a person who finally gets close enough to touch the thing they built their whole identity around, and whether getting close to it is ever actually what they wanted, or whether the wanting itself was the only part that ever felt safe. The former coach said one more thing before the interview ended, almost as an afterthought, that Alex used to tell her as a child that she didn't want to beat Nadia so much as she wanted Nadia to finally look at her. Actually look, the way you look at someone you consider real competition instead of a name in a bracket. If you rewatch that hallway clip with that single sentence sitting in your chest, the 4 words don't sound like a threat anymore, and they don't sound like a plea either. They sound like the exact moment a 13-year-old's private promise to herself finally became something she said out loud in front of adults who had the power to make it come true or crush it completely. And either way, there was no version of this where it stayed quiet, because a promise held that long doesn't get released gently. It gets released like pressure finding the smallest possible crack. What almost nobody clocked in the middle of all this emotional archaeology was the money moving quietly underneath it. A small sports business newsletter noted that a major apparel brand had accelerated a signing bonus for Alex, originally structured over 3 years, compressing it into 1. And almost as a footnote, that the same brand had let an option lapse on part of Nadia's long-standing deal. Alone, those facts meant nothing. Contracts expire, but placed next to each other, in the exact week the world was deciding whether it watched a passing of the torch or a manufactured storyline, they read like a verdict from the only people in the sport who never let feelings decide anything, the accountants. It dragged a story that had, for one strange week, become about a child's promise to herself and a champion's quiet grace, back down into the mud of who was being paid to be interesting. Alex's team called the timing coincidental, until an unverified internal email leaked, showing a marketing executive discussing rivalry narrative value as a literal line item months before the hallway clip ever existed. If real, someone had been planning to manufacture exactly this feeling long before either player said a word that mattered. Alex was asked about the leaked email directly. In a press conference every major outlet carried live, and for the first time in the entire saga, she did not sound composed. Her voice caught slightly on the second sentence, and she said she couldn't control what people decided to believe about her, that she'd been chasing this feeling since she was a child with a poster on her wall long before anyone in a boardroom had thought to put a price on it, and that if wanting something that badly for that long made her easy to turn into a marketing story, that wasn't a story she'd written. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a press room when a 19-year-old stops performing composure and starts just telling the truth, uncomfortable, unpolished. And that silence, more than any clip, more than any leaked email, is what finally tipped public opinion. Not toward forgiveness exactly, but towards something more complicated. The recognition that a person can be both genuinely obsessed and genuinely used at the same time. That those two things aren't opposites, they're symptoms of the same machine. Once that recognition took hold, the conversation shifted one final time away from villain and victim towards something closer to grief. Grief for what a story this human had been turned into before either woman got the chance to just live it. Just when it seemed like the whole thing might quietly deflate under the weight of nuance, it detonated instead. The two of them were drawn into the same tournament bracket, 3 rounds apart from a collision nobody had dared schedule on purpose. Ticket prices tripled before either woman had won her first round. Alex won hers in straight sets, then, instead of celebrating, looked directly into one broadcast camera for 2 full seconds before walking off. The single most replayed moment of the Tournament NT's first week, more watched than any actual highlight, because by then people weren't just watching tennis, they were watching a story they'd become emotionally invested in whether they meant to or not. Nadia's path was messier. A scare in round 2, 3 match points saved, a crowd half hoping to see the queen stumble just enough to make the eventual showdown feel earned rather than inevitable. When she closed it out, she didn't celebrate either. She just exhaled, long and slow, the exhale of someone who knew exactly what was waiting 2 rounds away and wasn't sure yet whether she was ready for it. Champions aren't supposed to admit uncertainty, but for half a second the mask slipped and the world did not forget it. The match everyone wanted never happened. 3 days before the collision, Alex withdrew quietly. A short statement about a physical concern. The internet didn't take that quietly, half convinced it was strategic, unwilling to risk an undefeated narrative against the woman she'd built her rise around. The other half convinced it was real, that carrying a manufactured rivalry for weeks had cost her body something it couldn't hide. Either way, the tournament ended without the collision, and unresolved tension doesn't fade, it compounds. Now there wasn't just a rivalry, there was a debt owed to a sport that had rearranged its week around a collision that never came. What happened next turned this from a story about ego into a story about something far more human, because 2 weeks later, at a smaller event away from most of the cameras, Alex and Nadia ended up practicing on adjacent courts. No officials keeping them apart this time. No scheduled distance. Somewhere between drills, without any microphone catching it clean enough to be verified, the two of them actually spoke for what witnesses estimated was almost 10 minutes, longer than any official interaction between them all year. Whatever was said in those 10 minutes changed something, because the next time Nadia was asked about Alex in a press conference, the edge was gone, replaced by something almost protective, something close to respect spoken plainly instead of implied through gritted teeth. She said simply that young players carry more than people give them credit for, and that she remembered exactly what that felt like once, a lifetime ago, before anyone was watching her either. And that's when the 4 words from the very beginning finally made sense. Not as a threat, not as arrogance, but as something closer to a plea disguised as certainty. A 19-year-old trying to convince a hallway, and maybe herself most of all, that she was allowed to want what she wanted without apologizing for it. The sport had spent months treating her hunger like a crime, when it was really just the oldest story tennis has ever told. The story of someone standing at the base of a mountain, terrified, saying the only thing that could get her feet moving, and the woman at the top of that mountain, the one everyone assumed would push her back down, turned out to be the only person who understood exactly what those words had cost to say out loud. When the two of them finally meet across a net, whenever that day comes, it will not be the collision anyone predicted. It will be something else entirely. Two people who found each other inside a story that was never really about rivalry at all. It was about being seen. And by the time the lights come up on that match, the whole world will finally understand that the loudest silence in tennis wasn't fear, and it wasn't rage. It was recognition.